If you want to follow along as we continue to work our way through the book of Ecclesiastes, you will want to turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 7. You know, in the early 1700s, there was a theologian who lived in Scotland. He was a theologian, he was a preacher. His name was Thomas Boston, and he and his wife Catherine had 10 kids. Unfortunately, they buried 6 of those children in infancy. One was especially tragic. They had a little boy, and they named their little boy Ebenezer. Now, it's not a name that we hear much today. I think Charles Dickens ruined that name, because when we think of Ebenezer, we think of a, crotchety old mean skinflint. But in the early 1700s, it was a popular name. It comes from the Bible, as most of you know. We sing that song, "Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come." It comes from 1 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 12, where the Philistines were defeated by the Israelites, and after the Israelites won that battle, they erected a stone monument. And that stone monument was an Ebenezer. It means a stone of help. So that after that moment, anytime the Israelites would see that stone monument, they would go, the reason we won that was not because of our own might and strength. We won that because of God's help. And so Thomas and his wife Catherine, they named one little boy Ebenezer, and he didn't unfortunately live very long at all, and before they buried him. Well, Catherine got pregnant again, and Boston thought real hard about, if it's a boy, to name this boy Ebenezer as well, the stone of help, acknowledging his hope in the power and the strength and the help of God. But as he thought about that, he couldn't help but to think, what happens if I do that? That's a testimony to my absolute hope in the faithfulness of God. But if something happens to that and that little boy and he dies, it's just a bitterness probably greater than my soul can handle. Well, after he wrestled with it for a while, he decided he was going to do that. And so the baby was born. It was a little boy, and they named that little boy Ebenezer. Well, unfortunately, Ebenezer, he was a sickly baby, and despite the prayers, the passionate prayers of those parents and many friends, that baby died too. A lot of people, if they experience something like that, a lot of people, even some who claim to be people of faith, they reach that point and sometimes they just say, I'm done with God. They just come to the conclusion that God was wrong, and he's unresponsive, and he's not caring if he's even there at all, and I'm done with the whole faith thing, and they just turn away and they leave God altogether. That's how a lot of people react. That's not how Thomas Boston and his wife reacted. Rather than letting that drive them away from God, it drove them just even closer to God. And he came to God, and he just wrapped his arms around God even tighter, seeking help and comfort in those dark, bitter times. Well, after that, he wrote a classic sermon. And that classic sermon is called "The Crook in the Lot." And in case you're wondering where that comes from, it comes from Ecclesiastes chapter 7. When he says the crook in the lot, what he's talking about when he says the lot, he's talking about our lot in life. When things happen, we go, well, that must be their lot in life. And when he says the crook, he means those terribly bitter things in life. Let's take a look at this text. Verse 13, the preacher says, "Consider the work of God, for who is able to straighten what he has bent?" Now, most translations, I'm reading, of course, from the New American Standard, and it says, "for what he has bent." Most translations say, what he has made crooked, whether you've got the NIV or the ESV or the New King James. For who can straighten what God has made crooked? And so the crook in the lot is talking about this. I want to take a look at this verse. This is one of the great verses in all of Scripture. It's actually one of the more familiar in the book of Ecclesiastes because it has sustained people for millennia. I want you to start looking at verse 13 with that first word where the preacher invites us to join him in making careful observation about how God works in the world. He says, consider. Consider the work of God. How does God relate to the world? How does he work in the world? And he answers that question. The answer comes next with a rhetorical question. For who is able to straighten what he has bent? Now, this is a picture of life. That's where we're going to start. When he talks about things that are straight and things that are bent, it's just another way of him expressing what life here looks like. We've already looked at a lot of different ways that he talks about this, and here he comes back at it again. There's some things that are straight, and there's some things that are bent. The things that are straight, that's just a metaphor for things that are good. Things that are bent or things that are made crooked are things that aren't good. Things that are straight, that's prosperity. Things that are crooked or bent, that's adversity. And that's how life is. It is full of prosperity and it's full of adversity. It's full of bad and it's full of good. We looked at that in chapter 3 with that poem that has 14 positives and 14 negatives, and the positives and the negatives just cancel each other out, and that's the way life is. There's going to be some days where the sun comes up and it is so bright and the birds are singing and everything is good in life. The job's going good. The family dynamic, that's good. The marriage, man, it is sailing along. The kids, they're all compliant and healthy and everything is great. If the kids are grown, they're making good choices and they've got their act together. There's just some times like that. Those are the straight times in life. And then there's other days when the sun doesn't seem to come up. And it doesn't sound like there's a bird anywhere that's singing. In fact, it's like nobody's singing. Because it seems like nothing is right with the world. The marriages, that's struggling. The job situation, that's tenuous. Parenting troubles, health problems, church troubles. And it's just like the trials seem to never end. It's a picture of life. The straight and the bent. And he says we need to remember this. The basic point is that, we're not in control of anything. That's just the way life is. Now, some hear this, and what they immediately think is, well, Solomon, the preacher, he's just a fatalist. You know, fatalism, everything's just fate. That is, que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. That was a song, actually, back in the 50s. I can tell you I wasn't around then, but I've heard it. And Doris Day sung it. She was an actress and a singer and kind of the pinup, one of the pinups of the 1950s. And that kind of became her signature song, Que sera, sera. Whatever will be, will be. It was what you would say when you would face challenging times in life and you just resigned yourself that you can't do anything about it. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't change it at all. Que sera, sera. Now, we have our own idiom today. We don't go, que sera, sera. We don't. We go, it is what it is. Right? That's what we say today. That's the 2020 equivalent to que sera, sera. Every generation has their saying, well, I can't do anything about it. It is unchangeable. I'm faced with something that is awful and it is bitter and it is completely unchangeable. Well, is that what he's saying here? Is that what he wants us to know? Is he just announcing that, look, it is what it is. You can't change anything. Just accept it and come to terms with it and just go through life understanding that it's all about fate. No, that's not what he wants us to know. That's not what he wants us to believe. Sure, there are a lot of things that are unchangeable, but there's something that's really, really, really important here that we just can't miss. There's something that is incredibly significant. And to really get the significance of it, we have to go back to the first chapter of Ecclesiastes. So turn over to the first chapter of Ecclesiastes and look at verse 15. It's the first time he's going to say these words. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 15, look what he says. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. That's the first time he said it. I don't know if when we read that here in verse 13 of chapter 7, you remember that. I probably doubt it, because when we first started this, it was before the whole COVID thing. And so I doubt you remember it. So it's important that you see that. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 15. What is crooked cannot be straightened. Now let me remind you of something that I told you way back then. And that is, as we began to look through the book of Ecclesiastes, we never saw God's name until the end of chapter 2. Up until the end of chapter 2, God was nowhere to be found. And he was describing life under the sun. The crooked cannot be straightened. We can't change really anything. And so the first time that he makes this statement in verse 1 and chapter 1 and verse 15, he leaves God out of the picture. But now he comes to chapter 7 and he puts God back in the picture. And that's the significance of this. Now he looks at the world. In chapter 1 and verse 15, he's looking at the world without God in it. When he gets over to chapter 7 and he gets to verse 13, he puts God back in, and now he's looking at the world according to God. And look at what he says there. For who is able to straighten what he has bent? Now notice what he does there. He puts both things, the good and the bad, the straight and the crooked, the prosperity and the adversity, he puts all of that under God's sovereign rule. And so this isn't just a picture of life. There are crooked things and there are straight things. There are good times and there are bad times. It's also a picture of God's sovereignty. Now, I want you to look at the very last part of that verse where it says, what He has bent. What God has made crooked. It sounds like He's attributing everything to God. And isn't that wrong? Surely everything isn't. God's not responsible for everything. Well, no. In a very real sense, God is responsible for everything. Not directly, but indirectly. Because God's sovereign over everything. And even all of the bad things that happen because of the permissive will of God. You remember back in Job, you remember, just flip back over there, part of the whole wisdom literature, and you remember what's going on in Job's life. There was nobody more righteous and spiritually sensitive and God-honoring than Job. And Satan, of course, comes before God in this strange conversation, and he makes an accusation against him and says, well, it's a crystal clear why Job's serving you, because, you built this hedge around him, and everything he touches turns to gold, and he never has known a sick day in all of his life, and yada, yada, yada. But if he didn't have all that, he wouldn't be interested in you. He would abandon you. He'd walk away from you. And God said, granted Satan this strange permission. Okay, you can have access to him. You can't kill him, though. And so Satan then unleashes literal hell on Job and his family. And you might remember a very famous scene from that drama in chapter 2, where his wife, it gets to the point it's so bad, he's lost everything, he's buried all the kids, and she says in verse 9, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. And look what Job says to her. You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? And of course, he would say later on, he would express it in such a good way as he thinks about all that God has done for him. And we get good from God's hand, and we get evil from God's hand. Not directly. Satan did this. But God allowed it. Satan can't do anything without God's permission. Everything is under his sovereignty. And so that's what the writer of Ecclesiastes is doing. He's saying, look, everything is under the sovereign will of God. This week on Friday, we were down at my daughter's house, and we were talking about something at one moment, and she talked about someone that I don't remember if it was someone she personally knew or someone that she knew of. And she said they prayed so long for a baby. They prayed so long. Just like Andrea and Nick and their struggles. They prayed so long for a baby, and God gave them a baby. And then within like 2 years, God took it away from them. That was her language. That's what my daughter said. She didn't know I was going to be talking about this passage Sunday. I don't go down there and go, let me tell you what I'm talking about. Let me tell you what I'm preaching on Sunday, sweetheart, and run it by you. She didn't know that. But let me tell you what I didn't do. I didn't go, oh, no. Don't say God took it away. Everything is under God's sovereignty. Everything. And even though he may not have directly done it, he permitted it. He permitted it to happen. He could have stepped in at any moment and he could have stopped that. But he didn't step in. And he didn't grant their request. And they lost their child. It's a statement about God's sovereignty. But here's where the great power of this verse is, and why this verse has brought so much comfort to people. You hear that and you say that, and suddenly you get distraught, and so many people then their view of God becomes shaky, and they begin to look at God sideways. Well, He's sovereign. That's not how we shouldn't take it that way. How we should take it is this is the way He means it. Everything is sovereign to God. There are bends in life. It's a part of living in this fallen world. He allows it to happen. And so you can lay it all at His feet. That's okay because He's sovereign over everything. But look what He's trying to tell us. He's saying, who's able to straighten what He has bent? The point is you can't, but He can. That's the point. That's the big point of it all. God can straighten out things that are bent, things that no one else can straighten out. Well, let's just kind of dance through the New Testament a little bit and just remind ourselves of that. That's what Jesus is showing when He comes and ministers. In Mark chapter 5, if you'll look over there real quickly. Over in Mark chapter 5, and what you have at the beginning of Mark chapter 5 is one of the great miracle stories, one of my favorite in all of Scripture, and that is the Gerasene demoniac. When Jesus got in a boat and He went on to the east side of the Sea of Galilee, and He encountered these men that they were just filled full of demons. They were living there in isolation. They couldn't live among people. The demons were so tormenting them. And it says in verse 3, He was dwelling among the tombs. No one was able to bind Him, even with a chain. And He often had been bound with shackles and chains. People trying to restrain Him from hurting Himself and hurting and terrorizing other people as well. And it said the chains had been torn apart and the shackles broken to me. No one was strong enough to subdue Him. Let me tell you something. That guy's bent. That's crooked. And Jesus comes along, and with just a word, He straightens what is bent. And people come and they see Him sitting there in His right mind. What is going on? I'll tell you what's going on. God is straightening what is bent. Over in chapter 6 and verse 48, if you go down there, the disciples are in the middle of the sea. Storm is raging. They're doing everything in their power. Verse 48, Jesus sees them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them. It's in the middle of the night. They can't do anything else. And so He comes walking out to them on the water, and He says, He just instantly gets in the boat, the wind stops, and they're utterly astonished. What's really going on there? Oh, let me tell you what's going on there. God's showing you that He can straighten out what is bent. If you go over to chapter 9 of Mark, look down in verse 22. This is a great one. A man has a son, and he's being terrorized by a demon. The disciples can't do anything to cast it out. And so he brings the boy to Jesus. This demon is throwing him into convulsions, and he's on the ground, and he's rolling around, and he's foaming at the mouth. And the man says, the father says to Jesus in verse 22, if you can do anything, take pity on us. and help us. If you can do anything. And look what Jesus says in verse 23. It's a mild rebuke. He says, if you can. If you can do anything, if you can. Listen, with faith, then he goes on to say, all things are possible. All things are possible to him that believes. And you know what Jesus did? He straightened out what was bent. He straightened out what was crooked. Luke chapter 7, verse 15. Jesus has just healed a centurion's servant, and he enters this little village in the Galilee, verse 11, called Nain, and there's a funeral going on. And there's this widow, and she's burying her only son, and she's in a most vulnerable spot being a widow. There's no one, it's a desperate situation. There's no means of support now. Jesus sees her in verse 13, feels compassion for her, says, don't cry, don't cry. And he came up and he touched the coffin in verse 14, and he said to the young man, get up. And it says the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mom. You know what he's doing there? He's showing us that he straightens out what's bent. We can't, it's impossible, Ecclesiastes 1:15. We can't straighten out what is bent. Ecclesiastes 7:13, but God can. Who can straighten out what God has bent? The answer is God can straighten out what is bent. You know, we think you see it even in the Old Testament. God has throughout history been showing he can straighten out what is bent. And in Daniel chapter 6, of course, we think of Daniel in the lion's den. You know, I told you, I was down Friday visiting my daughter. One of the things we did, we took the baby over to the University of North Alabama to see the lion. The UNA is the lions, and so they have this beautiful male lion. They always had two, and the Una, the female, she died recently, and so all they've got left is the male. And we went over there, and he's beautiful, and he was just laying and sleeping when we got there, but it wasn't long before he got up and he started walking around. And he roared. And we were just, oh man, look at that. Look at the paws on that thing. And look at and he yawned and those teeth. What a creature. And you know what I thought about? I thought about this. I thought, man, wouldn't be a good place to be in that habitat. That would not be a good place to be. But just think about the time that Daniel was thrown into a pit where there were multiple lions that had been purposely starved to just rip him to shreds. Now that's a bend in life. You can't do nothing about that. But God can. He can straighten out the bends. He can straighten out the crook. Who can straighten out what he has bent? Well, he can. And of course, we think of still in Daniel in chapter 3, of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. There it is again. Toss them in the fire. Can't do anything about that. You're going to die. Well, not if God doesn't want you to. God straightens out the bends. Now, of course, we know from this, though, and this is really important to understand here in Daniel chapter 3. I love what they say in verse 17. Our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of the blazing fire. He straightens out bends. He does. He can straighten out the things that are crooked. And he will deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we're still going to serve him. We're not going to serve that idol, even if he doesn't. Because he doesn't always do that. You know, we got the bends in life, and we've got the crooks in life, and we have the wonderful privilege of asking God to please straighten these out. Please straighten them out. And sometimes he is so gracious, and he does. And then sometimes he doesn't. I think, of course, of 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 9, where Paul is praying desperately that God would be gracious and straighten out this bend in his life. He calls it a thorn in the flesh. A messenger of Satan. Speculation has run rampant for 2,000 years of what that means. I don't know, but it must have been pretty intense for Paul to just keep begging God to straighten out that bend. And God finally responded to Paul and said, "No, listen, my grace is sufficient for you in this." You know, when we understand that God is sovereign over everything, and we can trust in His presence, and trusting in His sovereign presence helps us to know how to respond to both the trials of life and the joys of life. Go back to the book of Ecclesiastes again. Go back and look at that again. Look what he says in verse 14, right after he says, who's able to straighten out what he has bent? He tells us, look, when we come to understand God's sovereign rule, we know how to respond in both circumstances of life. Look at verse 14. In the day of prosperity, be happy. Look, times are good, great. Enjoy them. There's no reason to allow guilt to rob you of the joy that accompanies good times. Be thankful. Be happy when God in His sovereignty brings you good times. In the day of prosperity, be happy. But in the day of adversity, verse 14, consider. Now, when times are tough, the day of adversity, now look, he doesn't tell us to be happy there, does he? He doesn't say, be happy, be joyful. He says, now in the day of adversity, consider. Think about it. Consider that God has made the one as well as the other. You think about when things are bad, consider that God is in control. Don't forget that God is in control. Consider that. He's sovereign over everything. And consider everything that He has demonstrated to us. You consider in the day of adversity that He is there and that He cares, that He is by our side. We need to remember that whatever the adversity is, knowing that He is there by our side changes everything. Hebrews chapter 13, where Jesus says in verse 6, as He quotes the prophet, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you, the Hebrew writer says, so that we may confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not be afraid. What will man do to me? He will always be there. Look, when the adversity comes, I don't go, well, it is what it is. It's fate. I go, God is in control. And I know that God is able to straighten what is bent, and if He doesn't straighten it now, He'll eventually straighten it. And that's what keeps us going. He may not straighten it now, but He will eventually straighten all the bends. And He'll eventually straighten all of the crooks. Peter talks about that, of course, in 2 Peter chapter 3, when he gives us a glimpse of the end of things, and says in verse 7 that this present heavens and earth are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and the destruction of ungodly men. But we're looking for and hastening, he says in verse 12, the coming of the day of the Lord. We can't wait for it to happen. Well, why can't we wait for it to happen? Because He's made a promise to us, and He's going to deliver that promise when Jesus comes back. What's the promise? That He's going to straighten out all the bends. That God is going to make straight everything that is crooked. Now, Peter puts it this way. We're looking for and hastening, verse 12, the coming day of God, because of when the heavens will be destroyed by burning, the elements will melt with heat. But according to His promise, we're looking for new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. All sin is going to be done away with. All bends are going to be straightened. All things crooked are going to be made straight. That's why John would add in Revelation chapter 21, I saw a new heaven and I saw a new earth. For the first heaven and earth had passed away, And then he says, and I heard a loud voice in verse 3 from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they'll be his people, and God himself will be among them, and he'll wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no longer any death. There will no longer be any mourning or crying or pain. The first things have passed away. Let me tell you what that means. It means he will straighten all the bends. He will make everything that is crooked straight again. That's what chapter 7 and verse 13 is all about. And when Thomas Boston and his wife buried 6 of their babies, and he preached that classic sermon, The Crook in the Lot, he was saying, we're just going to trust God, because in the end, he's going to straighten out all of the bends. Well, that leads us to one real quick question, and we just really don't have time to spend on it at any length at all, but let me just kind of a reminder, why does God allow? And it's allow. Notice that I say allow, because he allows it. Why does he allow days of adversity in this fallen world? And there's a lot of reasons why he doesn't right now straighten all the bends. We can see these reflected in Scripture. One is that it helps us really assess where we're really trusting God or not. It's when we encounter those bends in life. It really helps us see, are we really trusting in him or not? You see, that was the whole Job thing. When Satan said, oh, he's not, it looks like he's trusting you, but he's not. You're just rewarding him, and as long as you're rewarding him, he's going to follow along. But if you don't reward him anymore, he's not going to trust you. It helps see. When we face those times, and if we come through with faith, it shows us. Another reason is, God is shaping us, of course. All of this is God shaping us so that he can ultimately live with us. But another reason that he doesn't right now straighten up all the bends is to turn our hearts away from the world and to look for happiness in the life to come. Can you imagine if everything was perfect here? We'd be in heaven. Oh, why would I long for anything else? If it's all perfect and good now, but if God straightened out all of our bends now in this broken world, and we went around in this broken world and everything was great, why would we even long for something else? The bends help us to get focused on what really matters. And then there's the fact that it helps us, bends in our life help us to become more dependent on God. That was the whole Paul issue in 2 Corinthians. God says, no. In your weakness, you're strong. In your weakness, when we're weak, we become more dependent on God. We recognize our own frailty, and we just hold on to God more tenaciously. And then sometimes God uses these bent things that he may not have caused, but will allow. He uses them sometimes to convict us and correct us if necessary, because he's for us. But as we end, let's think more about this idea one more time about God, considering God. 2 times there, verse 13 and 14, he says, consider. He invites us to think about the way God works in the world. Consider it. Consider that God is going to make everything straight. Like I said, that's what we hold on to. And that's what Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and verse 13 is all about. Hold on to God. The world is full of bends. It is full of crooks. And there's just nothing that we can do about most of it. But God can. And God will. For those who hold on to him, that day is coming when he will make everything straight. And so my question to you this morning is, are you holding on to him tenaciously? You may have some tough times in life that you're going through. And you may wonder if God is even there. He is there. He is sovereign over everything. Well, did he allow this to happen to me? He allows everything to happen because he's sovereign. If he didn't, he wouldn't be sovereign. But he allows it. But stop and consider. Think about God. He's sovereign over everything. No one else can change things. Only him. And so if you want things changed, hold on to him. Because no one can straighten what has been except God. So if you're not holding on to God, if you've never wrapped your arms around God for the first time by confessing him as the risen Lord, repenting of your sins, and being buried with him in baptism for the forgiveness of sins, we want to invite you to do that. Wrap your arms around God and start trusting him. If you've done that, but maybe you've wandered away, whether some things in life, adversity, days of adversity have come your way and it's left you sour on God, hopefully you've opened your heart to what we've talked about today, and you'll come back to him, realizing that only if you hold on to him will the day come when he straightens all of those bends. And if you need to make your life right with God just where you're sitting, please do that. But if you need to do it in more of a public way, please do that. We want to pray with you. We want to pray for you. So if you have a spiritual need to take care of, why don't you do it right now while together we stand.